Amber O'Hearn is a researcher with extensive experience in low-carb diets, known for her contributions to the carnivore diet and her advocacy for privacy-enhancing technologies. Please welcome Amber O'Hearn.
Hello, I'm Amber, and I am deeply honored to be sharing the stage with so many wonderful people, including people who are renowned researchers, and there's no mystery as to why they're here, but why am I here? People who know me probably think I'm going to go into some existential rant, but that's not what's happening. When Dave invited me, I hesitated because I knew what he was asking of me, and I wasn't sure I was going to be able to do it, because in order to talk about how it's possible that I could make so many contributions to a field in which I'm an outsider, that means I have to talk about my contributions. And so Dave gave me, required me to do something that I hadn't given myself permission to do, which is to talk frankly about some of my accomplishments. And so I thank him for that, but I want you to know that this is hard for me. Okay, so one thing about me is that I've always had a hard time doing things the regular way. And I did always love school, but I only participated when I felt like it. And when I was 16, I got interested in other things and left home and went to Montreal to hang out with my friends. I was never really intellectually challenged until a couple years later when I went to the University of Waterloo to study math. I had been admitted to a special program for bright, hardcore math enthusiasts. And I'm embarrassed to say that I flunked out in the first semester. I just didn't know how to learn in that environment. I think I didn't know how to learn actively at all. And another contributing factor was that I had had my first depressive episode and was on antidepressants. So I took a little while to lick my wounds and try to figure out what it was I really wanted. And then I finally jumped back into math again. And when I jumped in with a purpose, and I immediately started working with one of my professors, and we published some work on coding theory in theoretical computer science, 2 papers that I worked on, and I also worked with my psychology professor, Dr. Bruce. I wasn't a psychology major, but he could tell that I was really engaged and invited me to work with him, and we also did 2 papers. And this work was done in 1999 to 2002, even though the dates reflect the long time it used to take to get things published. But I really think that one of the contributing factors to being able to do all that was that I had started a low-carb diet a couple years before. It was in 1997 that I started that, and then soon after that, I finally graduated from Waterloo, not with a math degree, but I had cobbled together some of the electives that I'd taken and added a bit to that and got a Russian degree, which wasn't really what I wanted to pursue further, but it felt really great to actually finish something for the first time. And so the low-carb diet, I really think, was a great contributor to helping me get my shit together, even though I had only really started it in order to lose weight. And so all the time that I was doing these things, I was doing math, and I had eventually started a family, but I was also really deeply involved in trying to figure out what was going on with the low-carb diet. And so in addition to reading all the diet books that were written for lay people and the general public, like Dr. Atkins and Dr. Eads and Ron Rosedale and Lyle McDonald, I was also going back into the literature and reading some of the earlier work from Cahill and Owen, and from McGarry and Foster, and Kekwik and Pawan, and all kinds of stuff. I was obsessed. So I found myself drawing a complete blank later in 2008 when I had regained a lot of weight, even though I was doing everything by the book, and I could tell you any kind of geeky answer about what was going on with a ketogenic diet, but I couldn't solve my own weight problem, which is, ironically, I'm in a kind of similar position now, and I'm looking forward to my next insights. But what happened for me at that time was that I found this small group of weird extremists who were calling themselves zero-carbers, even though the reason that their diet was so low in carb was not because they were trying to minimize carbs per se, but they weren't eating any plants. And so all they were doing was prioritizing eating fatty meat to satiation and nothing else. That was pretty much all there was to it. They had made their own forum because back at the time they had been on Jimmy Moore's forum, and what they were doing he thought was too edgy and maybe dangerous, and he didn't want to condone it or be associated with it. And so they had gone and made their own forum. And I want you to think about that for a minute, because if we end up in a world where we're not allowed to talk about things that people consider dangerous, then, where would I be? It's really important that we can talk. So back then, and this was the late 2000s, we were already talking about any kind of contentious issue that you might hear people talking about today. So should we be worrying about eating too much fat? Should we worry about eating too much protein? Should we be counting our calories? Actually, we talked a lot about the problems of under-eating at that time, and there were people doing hyper-caloric experiments, eating 4,000, 5,000, 6,000 calories a day, and still many times having weight loss. We talked about whether or not we should be making sure that we eat organs. The answer to that was a definitive no, for good reasons, or whether people should be eating just like a carnivore diet but adding fruit to it. So, if someone comes along 10 years later and says, oh, I've got this great upgrade to the carnivore diet, you should be doing it just like that, but eating lower fat or adding fruit, just understand that that's not new, and that the reason that they are thinking that this is a new idea is because they haven't been reading what's been going on for the past 20 or so years. And for me, the carnivore diet changed everything. It was like when I first found the low-carb diet, except better, because in this round, not only did I lose the weight that was troubling me, but it put a lifelong mood disorder into complete remission. But it did have a problem compared to the low-carb diet, because there was no solid scientific basis for it. I mean, we had lore, and we had pioneers, and we even had some scientific study on safety because of Stephenson, who had done stuff in the 20s. So we had all that, but there was no literature that would suggest that a low-carb diet that had no vegetables in it would have any reason to be better for anybody than a low-carb diet with vegetables in it. And of course, a lot of people thought that that would be strictly better and that it might be bad not to have them. And so for me, this was problematic because I was very scientific-minded, and I didn't want to be seen as advocating for something just based on my own personal anecdote, because that didn't feel very good to me. So I couldn't rest until I could find some kind of scientific answer to this strange question of why it should be the case that I was feeling better than I had in my life without eating vegetables, even though that seemed to be obviously wrong. And meanwhile, lots of other people were finding benefits too. So I did talk about it. I talked about it on that forum. I talked about it in this little group called Paleo Hacks. Notice, by the way, that I had to pull up this page from the Internet Archive because it doesn't exist anymore. So you can see by my reputation count there that I spent hours and hours writing questions and writing answers for this one little forum, and it's all gone. Like, it doesn't exist, you can't find it. And so again, I just want you to think about that. If you are writing these great threads for, say, Twitter, or God forbid, Facebook, and That's not yours. And you have no control over whether someone's going to be able to find that or whether it's still going to be around in 10 years. And that's a real problem. So in 2012, I decided I was going to have my own website so that I could really be writing in a place that I could control it. And it had taken me 3 years to really own up to what I was doing and put it under my own name in that strong way and not just on these forums. Because I really didn't want to sound crazy, and I didn't want it to ruin my reputation for having a scientific mind. And I made this website to be separate from another website that I'd made where I was writing about science on the ketogenic diet. And I was calling it Carnivorous, which was a break from the zero-carb verbiage that people were calling it before. I was not the only person to use that word, and also later I shortened it to Carnivore. There was Ash Simmons, who had a website called Carnivore's Creed. So that was different. And then it took another 4 years before I started speaking about it in public. These two fine dudes invited me on their podcast, which was very popular at the time, and they asked me about my experiences on Carnivore and asked me to talk about some research I had done and presented at the Ancestral Health Symposium, which was also really important for me. And by the next year, I became the first person who was talking on the keto conference circuit about the carnivore diet, this new trend. I talked at Jimmy Moore's low-carb cruise, and then again at Keto Fest from the two keto dudes, and then at KetoCon in September. It was a really exciting time for me because everybody was really enthusiastic, and the organizers were supportive, and the audience was excited. And what I did in that talk was I took all the information that I was learning from the anecdotes of the people in those forums and the pioneers from Stephenson and the Bear, and connecting it to research that I was doing in behavior and physiology, and in evolution and human adaptations, and plant biology, and literature around anti-nutrients. And so all of this was work that other people had done, but the story that I built and the connections that I made were all original work. And that was really influential. I still meet people, even like recently, who tell me that they were at one of those talks and that it really changed their lives. And that's a great blessing. And it was highly replicated, too. I can remember in the subsequent years sitting in talks where I was in the audience and someone who was more influential than me was giving a talk about the carnivore diet, and it was 50% or more the same content, the same structure, the same ideas as how I had conceptualized it in this talk that summer. So the following year, I went to every keto conference that I could find, that I could get to. Went to Low Carb San Diego and West Palm Beach, and I went to Breckenridge, and I went to Keto Fest. And I noticed this trend that after every speaker, at least one person would come up to the Q&A and ask a question about the carnivore diet. And for the most part, the speakers didn't really know what it was and didn't know how to answer, and they might, based on their expertise, give the best answer that they could, but I could tell that something more was needed. And so I decided it was time to put together my own conference that was specifically targeted to the carnivore diet. As anyone here was there? It was epic, right? Really fun. And the reason that I'm telling you all this is because I think it's just not very widely known how much contribution I made to that whole trajectory and movement, because I'm not claiming that I came up with the diet. Obviously, I learned it from other people before me. but I think that I did have a lot of influence on even the name and how that came into the popular consciousness. It's just that I lost the race on writing the first book, not for lack of encouragement, and I was never invited on Joe Rogan. And as all this was happening, I actually started to feel like I was losing my credibility, and I felt like people were just seeing me as a one-trick pony, a one-trick carnivore pony. And people wanted to hear about the story about my bipolar disorder, which is an amazing story, and I understand why they wanted to hear about it, but there was so much else that I felt like I had to offer than just this testimonial. And I actually hit a low point when one of the first carnivore diet books that came out, the authors wrote to me, and they didn't ask me for editing advice or a foreword or anything that would really give me acknowledgement, but asked if I wanted to write a testimonial on how well their diet worked. And I think to this day they don't realize how hurtful that was to me. But I didn't lose heart, because a lot of people were actually really kind to me and really encouraging and gave me many opportunities. So I was talking about all kinds of different things on the forefront, I think, of ketogenic diets, like this idea about what's going on with ketosis in the Inuit, and what's the complex relationship between uric acid and ketosis, and should people who are on a carnivore diet worry about whether they're harming their longevity because of the mTOR hit? And so a lot of people were inviting me to talk about stuff, and I had a lot of wonderful experiences. And I was able through that to build a reputation that eventually got me invited to even collaborate on scientific papers, which was really exciting to me. So I lost the race on the carnivore book, but I got to write the first carnivore diet paper since 1930. Thank you. And ended up doing lots of collaboration with people that I have admired for a lot of my adult life. And so I'm really beyond thrilled with the opportunities that I've been extended. So I'm going to try to explain what I think about how I was able to do that. One thing is that science requires a delicate blend of arrogance and humility, and I've really nurtured both of those in myself. Arrogance you absolutely need, because you have to believe that even though lots of smart people may have dedicated their entire lives to something, and you think something different from them, that your idea might still have merit. And and you have to give yourself permission too. That was hard for me. I remember the week that I gave myself permission. It was the same week that I met Dave Feldman. We were at Low Carb Vail, and talk about arrogance. I started realizing that there were several people who were speaking on stage who were saying things that I thought, oh, they didn't read such and such. And I thought, well, maybe actually I could give a presentation and that it would be useful and would teach other people things. And it had never occurred to me before, because I thought to be on stage as a speaker you had to be a somebody, and I just hadn't given myself that personhood before. And of course, you also have to have humility, because you have to recognize that, yeah, you too could be making a mistake. You could be clinging to some idea that's your pet idea. And horror of horrors, you could actually be biased. So the way I deal with that is you have to earn trust through accountability. So you have to tell people where and how you got your ideas, because nothing comes from nowhere. And don't ask them to take you on authority. You have to, when you get serious criticism, and I don't just mean like trolls who are saying mean things, but serious criticism, take it seriously and own up to your mistakes, like loudly, and say, yeah, I made a mistake, and rethink everything that you need to rethink when that happens. I think that you shouldn't engage in zero-sum games. That's a game where your success is dependent on other people's failure. So like competitions of status, even to some extent academia can be that way. And for goodness sake, don't study logic so that you can win arguments on Twitter. Because that's another, winning arguments on Twitter is usually just silencing people. It's not furthering the discussion. Study logic, but study it so that you can recognize your own mistakes and be a better thinker. And don't make presentations so you can get clicks and drive the funnel. Like, make a presentation because you think you have something interesting to say. So instead of playing zero-sum games where you're trying to enhance your reputation at the expense of others, seek out other people who are intelligent and high integrity and play long-term collaborative games, because those people are out there and they're looking for you. So what's wrong with this credentialism thing? There are good things about credentials. It's really important to rely on other people for expertise, because we are long past the time, if it ever even really existed, where one person could learn the sum total of what we know as humans. We have to rely on each other. But if you only listen to people who have a certain degree, then you're cutting out everybody else who didn't have the money or had to focus on family or started out in a different career and then didn't have 6 years to invest in jumping through the hoops to get those new credentials. So university is actually a wonderful place, or it can be. People congregate there to hold themselves to a high standard. There's immense mentorship. I would go back to university in a heartbeat, really. But it's also not some kind of silver bullet. It doesn't guarantee that you will not be fallible or human or make mistakes. And it's not the only way to learn. So she puzzled and puzzed till her puzzler was hoarse. Maybe learning, she thought, doesn't come from a course. Maybe learning perhaps has a different source. You thought you were going to get through a presentation of Amber without some poetry. And last, you should be writing to learn. It doesn't literally have to be writing. You can be talking or whatever. But if you've ever heard the idea that you don't really understand an idea if you can't explain it to others, there really is some truth to that. This is a major reason why I flunked out in that first year at university, because I sat there in the class and I watched the professor write the proof, and I thought, yeah, that makes sense, that makes sense. And so I thought I understood it. And it's necessary to be able to follow what the person says, but just because you can follow it doesn't mean, that's really only half of it. It's necessary, but not sufficient. And I ran into this again when I started writing blog posts. So I knew that what I was talking about was going to be controversial and that I didn't have the credentials to just let people take my word for it. And so any time that I wrote something that I thought, well, even if I thought that my intended audience would consider it common knowledge or acceptable, I decided to really try to find a citation for every claim that I was going to make. And sometimes I couldn't find a citation for it. Sometimes, when looking for it, I found out that it was actually wrong, and I had to go back and rethink my entire argument, or sometimes abandon a whole thesis of an article that I was writing. And if I hadn't done that, then I wouldn't have noticed that I was carrying around beliefs that weren't actually true. So that whole process was a learning process for me. And at the time, I considered it actually a blessing that I didn't have a PhD, because it meant that I didn't allow myself to get lazy and ask people to take anything that I was saying on authority, and I had to go through that process. And in retrospect, I'm really grateful that I did it, because, you know, like 12 years ago, I was writing stuff, and I don't really remember necessarily why I thought X, Y, or Z. but I wrote it down, and now I can look back. So it's a little bit like if you're a programmer and you're writing code, you look back at it later and think, what were they doing? And that person was you. And thank goodness you wrote something about it so that you could tell what you were thinking at the time. So do it for yourself, if not for other people. So one of the projects that I would like to go toward moving forward is writing or using more open source tools for writing and learning. And I want to be sharing those and inviting people to do some collaborative learning. And I also would like to get more involved in promoting and maybe even creating permissionless, censorship-resistant sharing because of the ideas I was talking about earlier about how we have to own and take responsibility for our own data so that other people can't just turn it off at will. So I hope that you'll join me in exploring some of that stuff. And that's all I have.